Hey gang, we are in Norwood Park today at the Acacia Memorial Park Cemetery and Mausoleum, the famous Masons Mausoleum that we took a look at. You may want to check out that link. Pretty spooky in there, back over that way. But we're here today to visit the grave of the wife of a very famous captain here in Chicago, a schooner by the name of, well, it was the Christmas tree ship. And it was a ship that everyone loved back in the early 1900s, making its way on Lake Michigan, delivering Christmas trees from Michigan. And unfortunately, it would have a terrible fate. So let's take a walk. We'll walk to her grave, and it is a cenotaph to her husband because they were all lost at sea, and none of the bodies were ever recovered. But some things were, and we will talk about it. The ship's name, her name was the Rouse Simmons, and she would run the Great Lakes, well, Lake Michigan, Grand Haven to Chicago, and other places. A lumber ship, mainly. She was captained by a man named Herman Schooneman. But before we tell about the captain, let's talk a little bit about the history of the ship itself. She was built in Milwaukee in 1868 by Allen McClelland and Company, and she was named after a Kenosha businessman, Kenosha just north of Chicago here, named Rouse Simmons. And as I mentioned, she was a schooner, and she was owned by a wealthy lumber magnate. His name was Charles H. Hackley, and he was from Muskegon, Michigan. Mr. Hackley had a pretty big fleet of ships already sailing Lake Michigan's coastline, delivering that lumber mainly. A lot of those ships were delivering lumber back in that day. Of course, Chicago was using a lot of lumber, and not a lot of lumber around here after Chicago really became developed. So they would depend on Michigan trees, Michigan lumber, and the north woods of Wisconsin, all the famous lumberjacks of the day. And that's why these ships were so important to get that lumber delivered. It was at some point that her main mission would become delivering Christmas trees every year in fall. Of course, that was the hot time of year in November where everybody wanted their Christmas trees. No Christmas trees around here in Chicago, or the few that were cut down. It was in 1910 that Captain Herman Schooneman, or the soon-to-be captain, bought a small interest in the Rouse Simmons, which led to him being her captain. Now, Herman had two brothers. One was named August, his older brother. He was also running the lakes on his own ship, and they would do the Christmas tree tradition. And August sadly died in November of 1898. It was his ship, the S. Thal. It was a 52-ton two-masted schooner, and it sank in a storm near Glencoe, Illinois. Now, Glencoe is straight north of here, a suburb of Chicago, North Shore. So Herman continued on. It was kind of the family tradition, and it was very profitable. In fact, you know, they'd run the lumber to and from all spring and summer. You can't really run the lakes in the winter. And, you know, it was kind of the last run of the year. And they would pack those ships, and they weren't the only ship. There were a number of other ships that did this too, but they were the famous ship. And they were the famous ship because it was kind of a family thing. It was a tradition. They'd come to the Clark Street Bridge, come down the Chicago River, and they would set up camp there, and then they sailed in. They would have a Christmas tree on their main mast. They had the whole ship decorated, and everybody waited for the Christmas tree ship. And Captain Herman was known as Captain Santa. So it was a whole family operation, and they would make wreaths, and it was just really a warm, neat tradition. And they were doing well. Everything was going great. Well, as many days there, the November witches, the storm clouds would be coming over the horizon. And this time it would be fatal. It was November 22nd of 1912. Captain Schooneman loaded the ship with 5,500 trees from Thompson Harbor up near Manistee, Michigan, on the other side. He had a crew of 15 men, which included, well, he had a crew, but there were a total of 15 or 16 men, which included some lumberjacks. And they would be making that long last trip for the year across the lake to Chicago. And yes, those witches of November were working as usual. The snow, the sleet, the winds, the frightful lake. Lake Michigan, like Lake Superior, the other Great Lakes, could be more dangerous than ocean storms in a ship. The typical onslaught, which would discourage most captains from leaving safe harbor, but it was those Christmas trees could make a lot of money. They would get those trees from the tree farms in Michigan and Wisconsin. And the reason they could make a lot of money is because they'd skip the middleman. I mean, you'd be buying directly from them. It was the tradition to drive to Clark Street Bridge, go on the ship, and pick out your tree. I mean, that was the big hit. So no store, no innkeeper, no... they just would be able to keep all the profits. But they left on a day in late November, and there had been a storm, and there was another one approaching. There was another storm approaching, but the captain, he thought he could beat it. He thought he could beat the storm. I mean, basically, you have all of those trees already loaded. You have families waiting. He's got to pay the crew. All the promises he made and all the money. So he decided to go for it. Rolling the dice, I'm going to beat the storm. It was a bad decision, unfortunately. So off they went. Off they went. That second storm did brew up. It did come with a vengeance. The conditions were very bad when he left. And the little ship, when they left port, it was noon, crammed to the top with evergreen trees. Every corner of the ship sitting low. The dominoes were lining up. By the evening and into the night, the storm was hitting the ship hard. The captain sent 2 sailors up topside to check on the lashings on the deck, and in no time at all, both of them were swept overboard by a giant wave, and they were sent to their icy death. Now, I want you to just imagine for a second yourself. It's completely dark. You're up there you're already freezing, and all of a sudden this wave comes and takes you out in the dark. You don't even know what hit you, and you are in the icy cold water. And I've been in water like that. It's like razor blades hitting your body, but you know, I got out. They could not. Now you're on top, blistering storm, choking on water, crushed by waves in the dark. And you know in your mind, you're doomed. You have a minute or two, and it's the end of your life, and you are suffering. You are suffering. So they had this deck house built for extra trees in the middle, so it was difficult to get around up there to maneuver on the deck to begin with. Now ice was forming on the ship, and you've heard me talk about icing before with airplanes and how bad that is, how dangerous that is. It's the same for ships. What's the problem? The problem is the weight and making maneuverability more difficult, but the weight, and the ship is getting lower and lower, less maneuverable. And imagine, you know, you're not in a cabin like with a little steering wheel. You are up out there, freezing your butt off, soaked to the gills, wool gloves that are soaked, trying to steer some big frozen ice-covered ship wheel, and the rudder's probably frozen. You can only imagine what they were going through, trying to survive the night. Now they did survive the night, because the next morning it was reported by a life-saving station up in Kiwani that they saw the Rouse Simmons. She seemed to be floundering, tipping. There was one guy in a telescope that said he saw her, he was watching her, tipping to the side, listing. Low in the water, tattered sails, and she was flying her flag at half-mast, a signal that she was in great distress. Logs from the station show that a surfman spotted the Simmons at 2:50 p.m. and alerted a station keeper. And that station keeper found that the station's gas tugboat had left earlier, so there was nothing he could do. So he sent out the alert, and up in Two Rivers they found a couple of power boats, you know, just south of Kiwani, and they went on a rescue mission. But the little ship was never seen again. It's never seen again. Now, his wife, Barbara, was at the dock. The family was waiting for them to return. And she could not believe the ship would not return. She wouldn't accept it. She stayed there for 2 straight weeks before she finally accepted the reality that they were not coming back. And they never did. Nothing else was found at the time other than the occasional pine tree that would get caught in fishing nets. And at some point later, there was a message that was found in a bottle. It was found up in Sheboygan, which is just north of here in Wisconsin. It was corked up, and they knew it had to be from them because it was corked with a small piece of cut pine tree, a little chunk of pine tree. And the message said, "Friday, everybody goodbye. I guess we are all through." During the night, the small boat washed overboard, And we are leaking bad. Involved in Steve, lost 2. God help us. Then in December of 1912, the next month, you started to see Christmas trees and wreckage washing up ashore. Most of it in Pentwater, Michigan, it was reported. And then years later, in 1924, something really phenomenal happened. There was a wallet found washed up, and it was in amazing condition. Why? Because it was oilskin, and it was the captain's wallet. It had business cards and newspaper clipping. It had stuff in his wallet. It was his wallet. They found it. It's the only thing they found, really, personal. The bodies were never found. And for decades, nothing was found. But in 1971, they found the wreck. There was a scuba diver from Milwaukee who found it. And when they went down and they really looked it over, they saw that the ship had its steerage and it was sailing. The mizzen mast had snapped off above the deck and the upper portion was not located, but the mainmast was found forward to the port side of the wreck right there, the base missing, and the foremast is still intact today, lying on the lake floor nearly parallel, but on top of the mainmast, suggesting at least one of these masts fell out of the mast step as the ship sank. And many of those Christmas trees are still in the ship's hold, and every once in a while, one would surface and wash ashore. There are several items that were recovered since: the anchor and the ship's wheel at various, the yacht club, the museum. But again, crew members, the lumberjacks, nobody has ever been found. Now, I have to tell you that the Christmas ship, after this happened, Barbara, his wife, whose grave we're going to, she kept the tradition going. The next year, I believe. There's no ship, right? How did she do it? Well, she rented a schooner and she got the trees by rail. It had to be a money-losing enterprise, or at least a break-even, but she wanted to keep the tradition going. She wanted to keep the memory of her husband alive. What a great woman. What a great woman. And they did. They worked with the daughters. People would come on deck, and they kept it going. Sadly, though, by the 1920s, it would be the railways and the highways that would take over. And there were no more Christmas tree ships. No more. Here we approach the grave of the Schoonemans. And I see something that's a little Christmas tree, and it looks like a little wooden ship that somebody made for them, for their memory. Yeah, there's Barbara's name. So it's Schooneman, Herman on the left, Captain Herman, and they show his death date as November 22nd, 1912. I'm sorry, November 23rd. Very hard to read. And Barbara died June 15th, it looks like 1933. very hard to read. At least the camera can probably pick it up better. So, what a story. What a story. Very sad. But I'll tell you this, the tradition is such a warm story. You think about the Christmas tradition here and across the world. And it's such a heartwarming story what they did. It was an amazing time to live. Imagine being on the docks. Imagine the Rouse Simmons sitting there, and you're walking up and you're with your children and you're going to buy that Christmas tree today. And you get to pick it out. The Simmons was not the only ship to go down during the storm. There were a couple of other ships that day, that week. And there are thousands of shipwrecked and thousands of telling stories at the bottom of these Great Lakes. Thousands. Well, Barbara and Herman, Captain Herman, Juneman, rest in peace, and may you have eternal Merry Christmases wherever you may be. Merry Christmas and rest in peace.